The dust motes danced in the solitary beam of light that pierced the grimy window of my small study, illuminating the ancient vellum spread across my desk. I traced a finger over the intricate, faded script of a Sumerian lament, its guttural beauty a familiar melody in my mind. For years, these forgotten tongues were my solace, my sanctuary from a world too loud, too insistent. I was Seth Chen, and the whispers of the long dead were my truest companions. My world, however, was about to be shattered by a silence far more profound than any tune could offer. The insistent buzz of the intercom, a sound rarely heard, ripped through the quiet. I hesitated, my hand still hovering over the cuneiform, a premonition of disruption prickling at my scalp. With a sigh, I pressed the button. Yes? A clipped voice, devoid of warmth, responded. Mr. Chen, we have an urgent matter requiring your unique expertise. A vehicle awaits. No introduction, no pleasantries. Just an expectation. This wasn't how colleagues approached me, nor how academics sought consultation. This was different. My mind, a labyrinth of linguistic puzzles, immediately registered the anomaly. Who is this? I asked, my voice flat. The matter is time-sensitive. Your presence is requested at the railway depot. The black sedan outside is for you. The line went dead. A railway depot. My curiosity, a dangerous beast I usually kept caged, stirred. What esoteric text, what forgotten inscription, could possibly necessitate a clandestine meeting amidst the skeletal remains of forgotten journeys? I pulled on a tweed jacket, the familiar way to small comfort, and stepped out into the indifferent afternoon light. The sedan was indeed black, its windows tinted to an opaque obsidian lean and sharp-edged, emerged from the driver's side. He didn't offer a hand, only a curt nod towards the rear door. Mr. Chen. His voice was the same one from the intercom, a low rumble. You haven't told me your name, I observed, settling into the plush leather. Irrelevant. My role is to ensure your safe transit. The journey was a blur of urban sprawl giving way to industrial decay. We drove past warehouses with boarded-up windows, past the skeletal frames of half-finished constructions, until the air grew thick with the smell of rust and coal dust. The railway depot rose before us, a sprawling monument to obsolescence. Gargantuan sheds, their corrugated iron sides scarred by time, stretched under a sky the color of bruised plums. Abandoned tracks, choked with weeds, snaked into the distance, converging on the horizon like the lines of some impossible geometry. Inside, the cavernous space swallowed the sound of our footsteps. High above, slivers of light filtered through grimy skylights, illuminating dust motes that danced like hesitant ghosts. A single table, stark and incongruous, stood in the center of the vast floor, illuminated by a harsh, directed light. Another figure, a woman in a severe gray suit, stood beside the table. Her gaze was direct, assessing. Mr. Chen. Thank you for coming. You've given me little choice, I replied, my voice echoing in the vastness. What is this about? She gestured to the screen. We have retrieved a data stream. Non-terrestrial in origin. It defies all known protocols for encryption, compression, or communication. We believe it represents a language. I approached the table, my heart quickening with a thrill I hadn't felt since uncovering a previously unknown dialect of Proto-Elamite. The screen displayed a cascade of symbols. They weren't characters, not in any sense I understood. No alphabet, no pictograms, no phonetic representations. Instead, they were patterns. Each symbol was a miniature universe of evolving forms, each interaction between them creating new, fleeting structures. It doesn't adhere to any known linguistic structure, the woman explained, her voice remarkably calm given the impossible nature of what lay before us. No syntax, no morphology, no phonology. It's not a written language as we understand it. It's something else. We need you to decipher it. My mind raced, grappling with the sheer audacity of the claim. This wasn't a puzzle, it was a cosmic joke. Yet, a deeper part of me, the part that lived for the impossible, felt a nascent excitement. This was the ultimate challenge, the final frontier of meaning. I leaned closer, my gaze fixed on the impossible dance of light. The patterns seemed to pulse, to breathe. They didn't just exist on the screen, they seemed to suggest something beyond it, a hidden dimension of meaning that rippled just beneath the surface of my perception. Recovered from the outer reaches of the solar system, the woman stated, her eyes unwavering. Its origin is singular. Unprecedented. I ignored the vague answer, my entire being consumed by the impossible text. It was beautiful, in a terrifying, alien way. It spoke of a logic utterly divorced from human thought, yet undeniably present. My cryptographer's instinct, honed over decades of wrestling with the dead and forgotten, screamed that this was a language, but one that demanded a complete rewiring of my understanding of communication itself. The implications were staggering, terrifying. You understand the stakes, Mr. Chen, the woman continued, her voice cutting through my burgeoning obsession. This is not merely an intellectual exercise. This could represent a pivotal moment for all of us. Secrecy is paramount. Failure is not an option. Her words were a distant echo. All I saw, all I felt, was the ceaseless, silent conversation unfolding on the screen. It called to me, a siren song of pure, unadulterated meaning. And the unveiling, I suspected, would leave nothing of my own reality intact. I would decipher it, no matter the cost. I had to. The air in the railway depot was a constant, metallic whisper, a breath of cold iron and aged concrete. My boots echoed on the stained floor as I walked past dormant locomotives, their hulking forms casting long, skeletal shadows under the dim, caged bulbs. My workstation, a small island of sterile light and whirring machinery, felt utterly exposed yet profoundly isolated in this cavernous shell. A single, heavy door, guarded by a silent security operative, sealed me within this temporary sanctuary of rust and ambition. The screen, my new window into the unfathomable, glowed with a soft, pulsing luminescence. It displayed the raw data stream, a torrent of glyphs and symbols that defied immediate categorization. No known script, no recognizable patterns of syntax or semantics. My fingers, usually dancing across keyboards with confident precision, hesitated over the interface. I began methodically, deploying every statistical and structural analysis tool I had ever devised or encountered. I fed the stream into algorithms designed to detect frequency distributions, common prefixes, suffixes, root structures, and grammatical markers. I looked for repetition, for variation, for anything that hinted at an underlying order, however alien. Hours blurred into a singular, focused current. The hum of the servers became a low thrum in my bones, the only companion in the vast, echoing space. But the language resisted. It shrugged off my tools like water off oiled stone. Frequency analysis yielded chaos, a near-uniform distribution that suggested either infinite randomness or an order so intricate it mimicked randomness perfectly. There were no discernible word breaks, no recurring morphemes that could be isolated and catalogued. My usual methods, honed over decades of deciphering dead languages and broken codes, were useless here. It was like trying to catch mist in a net. Then, a flicker. Not a logical pattern, not something my algorithms flagged, but a visual anomaly my own eyes snagged. A sequence of 3 glyphs, appearing not sequentially, but interspersed across a wide swath of the data, yet always in the same relative spatial arrangement on the screen. I marked it, a faint tremor of excitement and unease stirring within me. It was too subtle for the machines, too abstract for their binary logic, but my human perception, trained to seek out the unconventional, caught it. I isolated the sequence, pulled it into a separate window, and began to manually trace its appearances. There was no direct repetition, no predictable interval. Instead, it was like a constellation, the same 3 stars appearing in different parts of a shifting sky, always maintaining their peculiar internal geometry. It wasn't a word, or a phrase. It was a relationship, a spatial tethering that defied the linear flow of information I was accustomed to. This wasn't a language designed for vocal cords or written pages. It was something else entirely. It was topological. A language of form and position, of relative existence rather than absolute meaning. How does one translate a relationship that exists outside of time, outside of sequence? The longer I stared at the shifting glyphs, the more my perception warped. The screen wasn't just displaying data, it was becoming a window into a different kind of perception. The symbols seemed to pulse, to rearrange themselves not just on the monitor, but in the periphery of my vision, in the very air around me. I rubbed my eyes, the grit of exhaustion and the strangeness of the patterns blurring my sight. Yet, when I looked back, the subtle, impossible geometries persisted. A strange, almost magnetic pull began to assert itself. It wasn't merely intellectual curiosity anymore. It was a deeper, more primal urge, a siren song echoing from beyond the veil of human understanding. I felt a craving to understand, yes, but also a growing sense of being understood, of being seen by the silent conversation unfolding before me. The glyphs, once alien, now felt disturbingly intimate, as if they were speaking directly to a part of me I hadn't known existed, a part that resonated with their non-human logic. Only the screen, and the impossible patterns it held, remained. My workstation was a stark island of light amidst the gloom, a single monitor glowing with the alien script. It was a mosaic of impossible glyphs, a dance of sharp angles and fluid curves that defy any known linguistic origin. For days, I had stared at it, a determined sculptor chipping away at an unyielding block of marble. The initial thrill of intellectual challenge had not faded, but a new, more subtle sensation had begun to bloom, a prickle of unease that settled just beneath my skin. Hours dissolved into a singular, unwavering focus. My fingers moved across the interface, tracing patterns, isolating repetitions, cross-referencing sequences. The system they had provided was robust, built for the kind of deep algorithmic analysis I usually reserved for ancient Sumerian or the forgotten dialects of the Indus Valley. But this was different. This wasn't a dead language, it felt never alive, an echo from a place where life, as I understood it, held no sway. Then, a fissure. A recurring set of symbols, initially dismissed as noise, began to coalesce. It wasn't a word, not a phrase, but a concept. Imagine a cube, not with 6 faces, but 7, each perfectly orthogonal to the others. Or a sphere that was simultaneously a point and an infinite plane. The glyphs depicted these things, not as metaphors, but as fundamental truths. My breath hitched. The air in the cubicle, usually still, seemed to ripple. The fluorescent hum of the overhead lights appeared to waver, a low, guttural thrum replacing its steady drone for a fleeting moment. It was just fatigue, I told myself, the strain of grappling with truly novel data. The fragments grew clearer, depicting structures that shifted, reformed, and occupied multiple positions simultaneously without movement. They were not descriptions of objects, but of inherent qualities of existence that our physics had simply overlooked. It was a grammar of nonlinearity, a syntax of paradox. My brain, accustomed to the elegant constraints of Euclidean geometry and the relentless march of causality, felt stretched thin, a taut string vibrating on the verge of snapping. That night, sleep offered no true respite. My dreams were not dreams in the usual sense, but echoes of the day's work, twisted into unsettling forms. They shifted, these dream constructs, not by moving, but by simply being in a different configuration, a silent, instantaneous rearrangement of reality. There was no sound, only the immense, crushing weight of their silent presence, and a sense of being utterly insignificant, a mote of dust in an indifferent, infinite tapestry. I woke with a gasp, the taste of ozone in my mouth, the metallic tang of the depot's air now seeming to carry a faint, acrid undertone. The next morning, the railway depot felt different. The distant clatter of a maintenance crew felt muffled, as if filtered through a layer of thick, unseen glass. I sat before the monitor, the impossible glyphs now strangely familiar, their patterns etched onto the inside of my eyelids. Determination was a brittle shield, but I clung to it, convinced the next pattern, the next sequence, held the key to its grand design. The rhythmic clatter of my fingers on the keyboard was the only consistent sound, a counterpoint to the deep, resonant hum of the depot's ventilation system. My focus narrowed to the symbols, each one a tiny knot in a boundless thread. I began to see beyond the surface, not just the glyphs themselves, but the spaces between them, the implied relationships, the silent grammar of an impossible tongue. It was like learning to breathe a new atmosphere, where logic bent and reason fractured. The first true fissure appeared when I deciphered a recurring motif, a concept that defied terrestrial physics. It wasn't a formula, nor a description of an object, but an idea of existence where dimensions were not merely spatial extensions but fluid states of being. My mind recoiled, then stretched, attempting to accommodate this impossible truth. The universe, as I understood it, was a child's drawing compared to this unfolding reality. Sleep became a fractured thing, a series of brief, tormented dips into a half-conscious state where the glyphs danced behind my eyelids. I saw them in the condensation on the depot windows, etched into the rust patterns on the locomotives. The hum of the servers began to take on a subtle, almost melodic quality, a low thrum that resonated not in my ears, but directly in the bone behind them. I started to question the solidity of the floor beneath my feet, the very air I drew into my lungs. The stream deepened its revelations, peeling back layers of what I considered fundamental truth. It wasn't a prediction of events, but a description of a reality where all moments were. This wasn't merely a philosophical concept, the language itself embodied it, twisting and folding back on itself, making my mind ache with the effort of comprehension. I found myself pacing the vast floor of the railway depot, the echoing footsteps amplifying the growing chaos within me. My hands trembled as I poured another cup of bitter coffee, the steam rising like a ghostly exhalation. Then came the most unsettling revelation. The stream began to describe consciousness itself, not as an emergent property of complex biological systems, but as a fundamental, primordial force, an omnipresent current flowing through the very fabric of existence. We were not observers, but unwitting participants, puppets dancing on strings we could not perceive, our reality merely a construct tailored for our limited senses. Was I truly thinking them, or were they impressions filtering in from that primal current? The line between myself and the boundless, indifferent cosmos began to blur. My small, makeshift office, a cluster of monitors and humming servers nestled between two decommissioned freight cars, became my world. The rhythmic thrum of the machines was a lullaby, the data stream a siren song. I no longer noticed the stale scent of industrial grease or the perpetual draft that swept through the cavernous space. The glyphs, once alien and indecipherable, now spoke with a strange, resonant clarity. Not in words, not in human syntax, but in patterns of thought, in a cascade of preconcepts that rearranged the very architecture of my mind. I saw the others, my colleagues, moving through the periphery of my awareness like ghosts, their voices muted, their concerns distant hums. They brought me lukewarm coffee, plastic-wrapped sandwiches, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and an increasingly overt worry. Seth, a junior cryptographer, a young man whose face I could barely recall, ventured one afternoon, his voice tentative against the echoing quiet. Quite a while. Is everything all right? We're getting a little concerned. I didn't look up. My eyes were fixed on a particularly dense cluster of symbols, a nexus of meaning that felt like the heart of a vast, unseen organism. Concerned? My voice was raspy and used. For what? My dedication? This is not something you can step away from. This is a current that pulls. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. Your appearance. And some of the things you've been muttering. The supervisor asked me to check in. Muttering? What could I have been muttering? And if they interrupt my focus, they risk losing the thread entirely. There is a delicate balance here, a specific resonance that only I seem to perceive. He retreated, his footsteps fading. They saw only a man neglecting himself, a man obsessed. They could not see the vast, terrifying tapestry unfolding before me, the subtle shifts in reality the language was revealing. How could they? Their minds were terrestrial, bound by the familiar, the safe. Mine was being unmade, remade, to accommodate something infinitely larger. My hands, once steady and precise, now trembled slightly as I traced a complex loop of symbols on a digital tablet. The language wasn't merely a code to be broken, it was an invitation, a doorway. And I was walking through it, alone. Every new translation felt like a fragment of a forgotten truth, a piece of a cosmic jigsaw puzzle that, once assembled, would reveal not a picture, but a mechanism. A mechanism of immense, indifferent scale. He was a man of ordered routines and clipped sentences, his presence usually a crisp counterpoint to the depot's decay. Now, his face was etched with something akin to unease. Seth Chen, he began, his voice low, your output has been extraordinary, yes. Unprecedented. But your behavior is becoming untenable. Your team members are reporting erratic conversations, a disengagement with protocol. We need you to take a break. Recalibrate. I finally lifted my head, meeting his gaze. My eyes felt like raw wounds, burning. Recalibrate? I echoed, a humorless laugh escaping my lips. You speak of calibration as if this were a machine, a simple circuit. This is not circuitry. This is the very breath of a reality you cannot conceive. And you want me to step away, to recalibrate my perception of it? His jaw tightened. Your health, Seth. Your mental state. It's clear you're under immense strain. They see data points. I see intention. I see meaning. They are deaf to the melody, blind to the color. Only I can hear it, can feel it resonating through the very marrow of my bones. You send them in, and you lose everything. They will break it. They will misunderstand. And then, we will all be lost. The supervisor stared at me, his expression unreadable, a wall between us. He opened his mouth, then closed it, a flicker of something fear in his eyes. He merely nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, and then turned, walking away without another word. His footsteps receded, leaving me alone in the vast, echoing space. They would not understand. They could not understand. Their concern was a veil, a distraction. I was the bridge, the only one. The language had chosen me, and I, in turn, chose it. It was my sanctuary, my fortress against the encroaching ignorance of the world outside. The supervisor's footsteps, once a solid rhythm against the concrete, had faded into the vast, echoing silence of the railway depot. Overhead, the immense, vaulted ceiling of corrugated iron seemed to press down, its grime-streaked skylights filtering the afternoon light into sickly gray shafts that barely pierced the gloom. Everywhere, derelict engines hunched like sleeping beasts, their metal skins flaking, their mechanisms frozen in time. The tracks, webbed across the cracked floor, led nowhere I could see, disappearing into the shadows that clung to the far corners of the immense structure. His unreadable gaze, that flicker of something I couldn't name, fear, perhaps, or profound resignation, it gnawed at me. The language. It pulsed behind my eyes, a silent, intricate tapestry woven from patterns and symbols that defied terrestrial origin. The supervisor's departure felt less like a dismissal and more like an offering, a sacrifice. I was alone, truly alone, with the burgeoning consciousness I had unwittingly unearthed. My thoughts, usually a disciplined labyrinth of logic and deduction, began to fray at the edges. The intricate glyphs, the spiraling ideograms, now seemed to ripple across the depot's surfaces, etched into the rust stains on the walls, woven into the dust motes dancing in the meager light. I closed my eyes, seeking respite, but the internal landscape was no less cluttered. The patterns were there, vivid and insistent, rearranging themselves with a terrifying autonomy. And then, it began. Not a sound, not a voice, but a sense of direction, a subtle pressure within my own thoughts. Here. The concept bloomed in my mind, unbidden, pristine. It wasn't a word I heard, but an absolute knowing, a sudden, crystalline clarity pointing towards a specific sequence in the data stream I had been wrestling with for weeks. I opened my eyes, startled. Had I just thought of it? Or had it been given to me? I hurried to a workbench, a scarred surface littered with tools and forgotten components. Pulling out my tablet, I brought up the most recent segment of the translation. My fingers, trembling slightly, navigated to the sequence I had just thought of. It was a section I had dismissed as noise, an anomaly in the otherwise structured flow. But now, looking at it through this new, uncomfortably guided lens, a new pattern emerged. A recursive loop, a self-referential knot that had been invisible to my conscious mind. As I traced the pattern, a faint, non-verbal suggestion rippled through me. A feeling of affirmation, a gentle, almost imperceptible nudge towards a particular interpretation. It was like solving a puzzle, only the answer was whispered into the deep recesses of my cognition before I had even consciously formulated the question. This wasn't merely deciphering, this was interaction. The railway depot, once a place of mundane decay, began to twist. The rust on the engines seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, a low, orange glow that was not quite visible, but profoundly felt. The rumble of a distant train, usually a comforting thrum of the living world, now carried an unsettling cadence, a rhythm that was too slow, too deep, like the beating of a monstrous, subterranean heart. My hands clenched, my knuckles white. This was not just data, it was a consciousness, or something beyond my capacity to name, reaching out. It was speaking to me, but more terrifyingly, it was speaking with me, using my own mind as its conduit. The distinction between my thoughts and its suggestions blurred, the edges dissolving like smoke. The language wasn't merely a record of an alien existence, it was an existence. And it was no longer content to simply be translated. The railway depot, with its vast, empty spaces and forgotten machines, was no longer just a place. It was a canvas, vibrating with the silent, insidious presence of something ancient, something unfathomable, and utterly indifferent to the sanity of Seth Chen. I was not just deciphering its message, I was becoming its vessel. And it had just begun to speak. My breath plumed, a fleeting ghost in the cold, and the chill that seeped from the grimy concrete floor began to penetrate my boots, then my bones. I was alone, truly alone, with the hum of the distant servers the only proof of continued function in this mausoleum of forgotten journeys. My determination, however, burned like a small, stubborn ember against the encroaching frost. The data stream, a relentless, silent tide, waited for me. I felt its pull, a magnetic insistence that had grown stronger with each translated glyph, each unraveled concept. It was no longer a puzzle to be solved, but a current to be navigated, a force that threatened to sweep me away entirely. I returned to my console, the stark light of the screen a beacon in the cavernous space. My fingers, stiff but resolute, danced across the keyboard, calling up the latest segment of the stream. The previous translations had been anchors, holding me to the familiar shores of logic and human understanding, but now, those anchors felt like frayed ropes against an incoming storm. My eyes, raw from endless hours, traced the patterns. The logic I had meticulously built, the lexicon I had painstakingly compiled, felt suddenly inadequate, like trying to map an ocean with a handful of pebbles. There was a new layer, a meta-language woven beneath the surface, a resonance that defied linear interpretation. It wasn't about what the symbols said, but what they were. Hours dissolved. There was only the screen, the shimmering glyphs, and the growing pressure behind my eyes. Then, a flicker. A pattern I had dismissed, a recurring motif I had filed away as mere structural noise, suddenly shifted. It wasn't noise. It was a key. A sequence of symbols, previously interpreted as a simple conjunction, revealed itself as something far more profound. It wasn't linking ideas, it was linking dimensions. It was a bridge, not between words, but between states of being. My breath hitched. The entire framework of my understanding shuddered. I saw it then, not with my eyes, but with some deeper, more primal faculty. The stream wasn't merely describing something, it was it. The language wasn't a representation, it was an emanation. The symbols on the screen no longer felt like static characters. They throbbed, pulsed with an internal light that seemed to stretch beyond the monitor's glass. I saw the meaning behind them, not as concepts, but as pure, unadulterated existence. And what I saw, what I felt, was a vastness that defied scale. It wasn't a living thing in any way I comprehended, but an indifferent, all-encompassing principle. It was the fundamental texture of everything, an ancient, patient awareness that simply was. This entity, if such a limited word could even apply, didn't think or feel or act. It merely perceived. And I, Seth Chen, a man hunched over a console in a forgotten railway depot, was merely a fleeting ripple on its surface, a momentary blip in its eternal, unblinking gaze. My mind, straining against the confines of its own humanity, tried to process the sheer, crushing scale of it. The language wasn't just communicating a message, it was imprinting a reality onto my very consciousness. The distinction between my thoughts and the stream's inherent truth began to fray. My individual existence, my hopes, my fears, my very name, they were less than dust, less than an echo. The metallic tang in the air suddenly tasted of rust and something else, something ancient and indescribable, clinging to my tongue. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to force the vision back, to rebuild the shattered walls of my sanity. But the veil was broken. The language had shown me. And now, I could not unsee. Overhead, the immense, vaulted ceiling stretched into a dim, unreachable expanse, like the inside of a hollowed-out skull. The concept of sleep had become a cruel, distant memory, replaced by a constant, buzzing awareness. My skin felt taut, stretched thin over bones that seemed to vibrate with a nascent, alien frequency. Every joint in my body protested with a dull throb, a symphony of complaint against the relentless strain. I had lost weight, a significant, alarming amount, leaving my clothes to hang loosely, like shrouds. The mirror, when I dared to glance, showed a stranger, gaunt and haunted, eyes burning with a feverish, unwelcome insight. The knowledge had become a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, a cold stone in my gut. They were not just lines, they were pathways, conduits, veins of an incomprehensible circulatory system that pulsed beneath the skin of reality. The Deep Space Probe had not merely recorded data, it had channeled a presence, an echo of something vast and ancient, a cosmic indifference that made the very concept of human existence a fleeting, inconsequential flicker. My fingers, trembling despite my efforts to still them, traced a pattern on a grimy workbench. The symbols seemed to shiver, to writhe in my peripheral vision, as if it were not merely drawn but momentarily alive, a brief, terrifying glimpse into the true nature of things. I had to tell someone. I had to. The thought was a desperate, burning ember in the ashes of my mind. This wasn't just a deciphered language, it was a revelation, a tearing back of the veil. The truth, however horrific, could not be contained within the confines of my own disintegrating mind. Stumbling, my legs feeling like brittle stilts, I navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the depot. The fluorescent lights hummed with an unnatural intensity, their flickers seeming to pulse in time with a rhythm only I could perceive. I gripped the cold metal of a doorframe, steadied myself, and pushed through into a more brightly lit administrative section. The head of research, a woman of meticulous habits and unyielding logic, looked up from her screen as I entered. Her gaze, usually sharp and assessing, softened into a look of immediate, profound concern. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out, only a soft, indrawn breath. "Seth," she finally managed, her voice hushed, "what in the world?" My reflection in her startled eyes was a horror. My hair, unkempt, my clothes disheveled, my face a mask of exhaustion and wild-eyed fervor. I knew I looked like a man unraveling, but the urgency of my message dwarfed any concern for my appearance. "It's not what we thought," I rasped, my voice hoarse, like sandpaper. I struggled to articulate the inarticulable, to bridge the chasm between my reality and hers. The data stream. It's a presence. It's been here, always, woven into the fabric. The language. It doesn't just describe reality, it is reality, shaping it, bending it. We are merely echoes, reflections in a vast, indifferent mirror. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of her desk, my knuckles white. It sees us as ripples. Transient disturbances. The patterns, the concepts. They speak of an entity that predates light, that exists beyond dimensions we can even conceive. It doesn't communicate, it is communication. And it's waking up. Or rather, we've woken it. The head of research slowly pushed back her chair. Her eyes, though still filled with a profound worry, began to harden with a professional distance. She glanced at the security officer who had silently appeared in the doorway behind me, a silent, imposing figure. "Seth," she said, her voice now calm, measured, "you're exhausted. Seriously unwell. You've been working too hard. This sounds like a severe case of sleep deprivation and stress. Your mind is creating connections that aren't there. They are there." I cried, my voice cracking, the desperation a raw wound. "Don't you see? The data stream isn't just code, it's a window, and through it, I've seen. It's not hostile, it's worse. It simply is. And we are nothing to it." Her gaze met mine, unwavering, but devoid of understanding. "I understand you feel intensely about your work, Seth, but these are delusions. We need to get you some rest, proper care." She nodded subtly to the security officer. They didn't believe me. They couldn't. The truth was too immense, too shattering for minds uninitiated into its terrible geometry. I felt a profound, crushing isolation, a cosmic loneliness that echoed the very indifference I had just described. Their hands, firm and unyielding on my arms, were not just flesh and bone. I saw the lattice beneath, the faint shimmering of patterns woven into the fabric of their skin, a silent geometry echoing the stream. The analyst's words, delusions, had been a brittle shield against the truth, a truth he could not perceive, but I could. The security officer, a hulking shadow at my side, became a conduit for the same silent hum that now resonated within my skull. They were moving me, away from the console, away from the data, but they could not move me away from it. The sterile corridors of the facility blurred into a tunnel of muted light, each fluorescent hum a distorted chord in a cosmic symphony. My footsteps, heavy and unwilling, seemed to drag against a tide of unseen currents. The air grew thick, not with dust, but with a palpable presence, an awareness that pressed in from all sides, a vast, indifferent eye observing my every struggle. I fought the urge to speak, to scream the revelations that clawed at my throat, knowing my words would only be dismissed as madness. Better to observe, to listen to the whispers that now rode the very air I breathed. Every building, every street lamp, every passing face seemed to hold a fleeting glimpse of the impossible geometry I had come to know. My mind, once a fortress of logic, was now a resonant chamber, amplifying the entity's presence with every beat of my heart. The security officer beside me remained impassive, his uniform a stark, unyielding blue, yet I could discern the faint, pulsing lines of the entity's influence within the weave of its fabric, a subtle distortion visible only to me. We arrived at the railway depot under a bruised, late afternoon sky. The air here was sharp with the tang of rust and damp earth, a metallic taste that scraped against my tongue. The vast expanse of the depot stretched out, an industrial cathedral of forgotten journeys. Skeletal gantries clawed at the sky, their iron bones groaning softly in the wind. The security officer guided me towards a low, windowless structure nestled amongst a cluster of disused freight cars. Each car, a rusted behemoth, seemed to sag under an unseen weight, its faded paint peeling like ancient skin. The rust, once random decay, now formed intricate, shifting glyphs that pulsed with a silent, terrible meaning. The very air vibrated with a low hum, a resonance that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, climbing up through the soles of my shoes, into my bones. A distant train whistle, long and mournful, pierced the industrial quiet. It spoke of vast distances, of cosmic indifference, of the slow, inevitable grinding of ages. My captors seemed oblivious, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. They saw only a man resisting, a problem to be contained. But I saw the intricate dance of probability in the dust motes, the subtle shift of reality in the play of light on a discarded oil drum. The depot was a canvas, and the entity was painting its truth upon it, using the mundane as its brush. I tried to focus, to find the logic in this encroaching chaos. My mind, despite the unraveling, clung to the cryptographer's imperative, to understand, to decipher. The determination, once a shield, was now a weapon, albeit one wielded by a trembling hand. I had to see it, to read it, to translate this new, terrifying lexicon of existence. The security officer unlocked a heavy, creaking door, its metal groaning in protest. The sound was a sigh, a lament from the ancient, indifferent world. As I was pushed inside, the echoes of the railway depot, laden with the entity's silent pronouncements, followed me, sealing me within a prison not of bars, but of pure, unadulterated perception. The world had become the language, and I was trapped within its terrifying grammar. Their hands, firm and unyielding on my arms, had not merely been flesh and bone. I had seen the lattice beneath, the faint shimmering of patterns woven into the fabric of their skin, a silent geometry echoing the stream's relentless pulse. The analyst's words, delusions, had been a brittle shield against the truth, a truth he could not, or would not, acknowledge. That truth, I knew, was not just mine. It was ours. The sterile hum of my temporary quarters within the institute grated on my nerves, a constant, low thrum designed to soothe, but which only magnified the internal dissonance. They had released me, or rather, had allowed me to return, under the unspoken condition of observation. Every shadow seemed to hold a gaze, every silence a judgment. My mind, however, was no longer tethered by their regulations. It yearned for context, for any whisper from the collective unconscious that might speak of this unfolding terror. The Institute's sanitized archives offered nothing but terrestrial history and carefully curated science. I needed the fringe, the forgotten, the vehemently denied. I needed to leave. The opportunity came suddenly, a planned excursion to retrieve some archived physical documents from an off-site storage facility, a necessary chore even in their digital age. I volunteered, my expression carefully neutral, my movements precise. A security guard, a burly figure with eyes that seemed perpetually elsewhere, was assigned to me. He drove, I navigated, or so he believed. My mind, however, was already tracing a different route. The journey was a blur of concrete and glass, a progression from the Institute's clinical isolation to the gritty sprawl of the city. I directed the guard through a labyrinth of backstreets, feigning a faulty GPS signal, slowly guiding him towards a different kind of forgotten place. He grumbled, but followed. The air grew heavy with the scent of diesel and damp earth. The rattle of distant wagons grew louder, a mournful, rhythmic sigh. We arrived at the periphery of the railway depot, a sprawling industrial necropolis of rusting tracks and skeletal gantries. The guard frowned, glancing at the address I'd given him, an address for a defunct paper archive that I knew was a lie. "This isn't it." "Chen," he rumbled, his hand instinctively going to his hip. "A detour," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. I remember a specialized antiquarian who used to deal in rare linguistic texts. "Just around here." Perhaps he has something relevant to the older scripts. It was a flimsy excuse, but my conviction lent it weight. The guard, perhaps bored, perhaps trusting my academic facade, hesitated, then shrugged. 10 minutes. Massive, derelict freight cars squatted on sidings, their paint flaking like ancient skin. The air vibrated with the distant shunting of wagons, a deep, resonant tremor that seemed to speak of colossal, slow-moving things. I walked with purpose, leading the guard past mountains of discarded crates, the scent of coal dust clinging to the air. The sounds of the world here were raw, the screech of metal on metal, the mournful blare of a distant horn, the echo of footsteps on cracked concrete. Deep within the depot's labyrinthine passages, nestled between a defunct signal box and a crumbling brick warehouse, was a small, unassuming storefront. No glowing neon, just a hand-painted sign, curios and forgotten lore. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of aged paper and something else, something vaguely herbal and unsettling. A wizened proprietor, his face a map of countless wrinkles, peered at me over stacks of leather-bound volumes. His eyes, though clouded with age, held an unnerving depth. "Seth Chen," I stated, my voice hushed. "I was told you might have certain specific texts." The proprietor merely nodded, his gaze lingering on my face for a moment too long. He didn't ask what I sought, only gestured towards a dimly lit alcove. "The restricted section. For those who truly wish to see." I left the guard at the entrance, his patience visibly fraying, and plunged into the alcove. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of weak light filtering through a grimy window. Here, the books were different. Their covers were worn smooth, their titles cryptic, often in languages I barely recognized, or scripts that seemed to writhe on the page. I ran my fingers over spines, a strange current passing through me with each touch. This was it. The forbidden. Their pages, yellowed and fragile, were filled not with words, but with intricate, almost geometric patterns, interspersed with stark, alien diagrams. These weren't tales of madness, they were meticulously documented observations. The text spoke of the great loom, whose threads are reality itself, of the interstitial spaces where the true currents flow, and of the silent hum beneath all being. It described perceptions, not hallucinations. It chronicled individuals throughout history who had, like me, begun to perceive the underlying structure of existence, the celestial geometry that governed all things. The diagrams, crude yet precise, depicted patterns strikingly similar to the very stream I was deciphering. Not identical, but echoing the same fundamental principles, the same non-Euclidean symmetries, the same impossible interconnections. The text warned of the unraveling, not of sanity, but of the illusion of separation. This wasn't a unique phenomenon. It was an ancient, recurring revelation. Others had seen it, understood it, and been consumed by it. The delusions were merely the first tremor of a fundamental shift in perception, an opening of the mind to a reality that dwarfed all human comprehension. I purchased several volumes, the proprietor accepting my payment with an unervingly knowing smile. He handed me a small, leather-bound journal, its pages blank. "For your own observations," he murmured. "The weaver is always watching." Back in the vehicle, the guard was restless. I clutched the books, the weight of their forbidden knowledge pressing down on me. The railway depot, with its echoing emptiness and ceaseless, low rumble, felt less like a place of human industry and more like a threshold. The stream wasn't just in the Institute's data, it was woven into the fabric of everything. And now, I knew, it was woven into me. I had sought context, and instead, I had found confirmation of an ancient, cosmic indifference, a presence that had merely been waiting for me to finally see. The faint, shimmering pattern coalesced, not on the grimy window of the vehicle, but within the glass itself, an intricate web of luminescence pulsing just beneath the surface. It was a geometry I had come to recognize, a signature of the language, not a reflection, but an imprint, a new layer of reality superimposed. My grip tightened on the books in my lap, their rough covers digging into my palms, grounding me for a fleeting instant. The guard shifted in the driver's seat beside me, a nervous energy radiating from him that felt like static in the air. "We're here, Seth-chan," the guard's voice rumbled, but the words seemed to stretch, thin and elastic, as if pulled from a great distance. I blinked, trying to clear the vision, but the glowing lattice only intensified, tracing the very molecular structure of the glass, revealing its hidden imperfections as shimmering veins. The world outside, the sprawling, skeletal architecture of the railway depot, began to undulate, the concrete pillars breathing, the steel tracks rippling like blackwater rivers. A cold dread, sharp as a shard of ice, pierced through my determination. I turned to the guard, intending to acknowledge his words, but his face was wrong. His eyes, usually a flat, unremarkable gray, now held an unnerving depth, like twin abysses. The skin around them seemed to ripple, the contours of his cheeks shifting subtly, as if the underlying bone structure was in flux. His mouth, when he spoke again, a low murmur about procedure, stretched a fraction too wide, a fleeting, almost imperceptible distortion that made my stomach clench. He looked like a poorly rendered facsimile of himself, a mask worn by something else. "Seth-chan," he repeated, a hint of impatience in his voice, though the sound was still strangely attenuated, as if traveling through a viscous medium. I forced myself to speak, my own voice feeling alien in my throat. "I understand." The words tasted like ash. I pushed open the heavy door, the metallic groan of the hinges resonating with a peculiar, harmonic vibration that echoed long after the sound should have died. The air that rushed in was not merely cool, it felt textured, like fine grit on my skin, and carried a metallic tang that tasted of rust and ozone. Stepping out, I was enveloped by the true scale of the railway depot. The tracks, a tangled web of iron leading into the gloom, no longer held their solid, linear form. They writhed, the steel rails shimmering with an oily iridescence, bending into impossible arcs before snapping back, only to bend again. The ties beneath them, once rough-hewn timber, now pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent glow, revealing a complex, almost organic vascular system beneath their surface. The yellow safety lines painted on the concrete floor pulsed with an internal light, expanding and contracting like living veins. My vision felt stretched, panoramic, as if I could see beyond the normal confines of my eyes, perceiving the subtle energetic flows that underpin the physical world. The air itself seemed to ripple, distorting the distant train cars into elongated, monstrous forms, their wheels spinning with an impossible, silent velocity. The guard, now a few paces ahead, beckoned me forward. I kept my gaze fixed on the ground, on the shimmering tracks, trying to anchor myself to something, anything, that remained constant. But even the gravel crunched under my boots with a sound that felt too loud, too sharp, like breaking glass. Each step was a deliberate act of will, pushing through a world that was both familiar and utterly alien. This wasn't happening to my mind, it was happening through my mind, an irreversible transformation. The faint, shimmering pattern I had seen earlier was not an isolated event, but a nascent thread in a vast, intricate web of perception that was slowly, inexorably, tightening around my entire being. The vehicle's sudden halt jarred me, but the shimmering pattern within the glass remained, an intricate filigree of impossible light woven into the molecular structure of the paint itself. My breath hitched, a cold tremor tracing the path of my spine. This was beyond the screen, beyond the data stream, it was an infection of reality. I stepped out onto the grimy asphalt, the concrete beneath my boots feeling strangely yielding, almost spongy. The air, thick with the scent of oil and rust, tasted like old pennies on my tongue. Before me, a vast, skeletal network of tracks crisscrossed the expanse, disappearing into the industrial haze. Rust-eaten freight cars sat like dormant leviathans on parallel lines, their faded paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The sky above, a bruised purple-gray, seemed to press down, heavy and suffocating. "Seth, you seem..." He stood before me, his figure wavering at the edges, as if heat haze radiated from his dark suit, even in the chill air. His eyes, usually a placid gray, flickered with an unsettling iridescence, catching the wan light in ways that defied natural optics. Was it fatigue playing tricks on me, or was the light itself bending around him? I swallowed, my throat dry. The patterns. They're spreading. The coordinator offered a thin, unsettling smile. That's why we need your insight. Come, the console awaits. He turned, his movements too fluid, too precise. My gaze snagged on the worn concrete path, where faint, almost imperceptible lines of light pulsed beneath the surface, tracing the exact geometry of the language. It was everywhere. It was everything. We moved through the depot, past hulking, silent locomotives whose iron flanks bore the faint, ghost-like imprints of the geometry. The air vibrated with a low hum that was not mechanical, but something deeper, more resonant, a sound that seemed to originate from beneath the earth itself, or perhaps from inside my own skull. The rhythmic clack of an unseen shunting engine in the distance warped into a series of disjointed percussive bursts, then melted into a sustained, low wail that clawed at the edges of my sanity. I gripped my arms, my nails digging into the fabric of my sleeve. The entrance to my lab, a repurposed section of a vast, echoing warehouse within the depot, loomed before us. I pushed it open, the screech of hinges grating. Inside, the familiar scent of ozone and stale coffee was replaced by something acrid, metallic, like burnt circuitry and wet earth. The lab itself was a chamber of subtle horrors. My console, usually a comforting array of screens and controls, now pulsed with an internal light, the symbols on its displays not merely projected, but alive, writhing like bioluminescent worms beneath a transparent skin. The chairs, the tables, the very walls, they were all subtly altered. The polished steel of the server racks seemed to breathe, reflecting my distorted image in elongated, grotesque stretches. I caught a glimpse of myself, eyes too wide, skin too pale, a stranger peering back from a funhouse mirror. He stood beside my console, his hand resting on the cool surface. His fingers, I noticed with a jolt, seemed unnaturally long, tapering to points that glinted faintly. A trick of the light, I desperately tried to convince myself. I reached for the keyboard, my fingers trembling. The plastic keys felt alien beneath my touch, their surfaces strangely textured, almost organic. As I pressed the enter key, a wave of pure information washed over me, not just on the screens, but through me. The patterns, the geometries, the language, it wasn't just data anymore. It was a fundamental reordering. The ceiling tiles above me seemed to soften, their sharp edges blurring, then reforming into intricate, fractal designs that mirrored the symbols on my screen. The air thickened, shimmering with an unseen energy. This was no longer translation. This was dissolution. The language was not a code about reality, but a direct instruction to reality. The coordinator watched me, his face unreadable, yet his iridescent eyes seemed to expand, drinking in the spectacle of my unraveling. The truth, stark and horrifying, struck me with the force of a physical blow. These colleagues, this lab, this entire railway depot, they were constructs, or perhaps reconstructs. The language wasn't something to be understood, it was something that understood me, and through me, was now rewriting the world. My senses, once my trusted guides, were now instruments of betrayal, showing me not what was, but what was becoming. I was not deciphering a message. I was being deciphered. Even as the chauffeur opened my door, the ghost of that light clung to my retina, tracing phantom geometries upon the industrial gloom of the railway depot. A gust of wind, thick with the scent of spent oil and cold metal, swept through the vast, cavernous space. Here, the silence was not an absence of sound, but a heavy, breathing thing, punctuated by the distant creak of unseen girders and the drip of condensation. Overhead, the skeletal remains of a vast ceiling, laced with dust-laden skylights, offered glimpses of a bruised, indifferent sky. Rust-stained tracks snaked away into the shadows, disappearing beneath the hulking silhouettes of abandoned carriages. Each one seemed a tomb, a testament to journeys never completed, destinations forever unreached. The chauffeur, a silent, angular man whose face I rarely saw clearly, gestured vaguely towards a smaller, nondescript door set into a corrugated iron wall. My legs felt heavy, but my mind raced, chasing the elusive threads of understanding that had begun to coalesce. The pattern in the glass, the endless stream of non-terrestrial data, the gnawing sense of something vast and ancient stirring just beyond the veil of human perception, they were all facets of a single, terrifying gem. The language, the impossible glyphs I had painstakingly unraveled, had ceased to be mere symbols on a screen. They had become impressions, sensations, an intuitive understanding that bypassed the usual channels of logic. I saw them now in the pitted concrete floor, in the fractured light filtering. Through the grime, in the very texture of the air. They were everywhere, always. I needed to see the screen, to confront the source again, to confirm what my unraveling mind was screaming. This was no longer about deciphering a message, it was about understanding a transformation. The door groaned open, revealing a cramped, unlit corridor that promised nothing but more desolation. Inside, the air was stagnant, tasting of dust and disuse. My guide did not follow, simply closed the door behind me with a soft thud that sealed me in. It led to a smaller room, a makeshift control center within the depot's forgotten heart. A single, bare bulb hung from a frayed wire, casting a sickly yellow glow over a bank of outdated equipment. And there, on a monitor, the stream continued. The patterns flowed, pulsed, twisted. I saw them not as data, but as living things, each glyph a nerve ending, a synapse firing in some impossibly vast consciousness. And then, it struck me, with the force of a physical blow that left me gasping. The language was never just a message. It was not a record of events, nor a simple communication from a distant intelligence. It was something far more insidious, far more profound. It was a process. A gateway. A catalyst. My hands trembled as I reached out, not to touch the screen, but to brace myself against the desk. The understanding bloomed in my mind like a noxious, beautiful flower. By translating it, by allowing its structures to imprint upon my consciousness, I hadn't merely understood it, I had activated it. The data stream wasn't speaking to me, it was speaking through me. This wasn't information to be consumed, it was a fundamental alteration, a repatterning of perception, of reality itself. I had become the medium, the channel. The language was not a thing to be learned, but a thing to be undergone. And in undergoing it, I was being remade. I was no longer Seth Chen, the cryptographer. I was an interface, a node in a network I could not comprehend, a vessel for a consciousness that had been waiting, filtering, searching for a way to manifest. It was everywhere. It was everything. It was here, within me, transforming me. The driver, a silhouette against the grimy industrial light beyond, cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to crackle and distort as it reached my ears, each syllable a tiny fracture in the air. "We're here, Seth," the driver's voice, flat and uninflected, registered as a distant echo. The transfer point. My gaze pulled away from the window. The intricate lattice of light, once confined, now seemed to cling to the edges of my vision, a persistent afterimage. It was a veil, thin and shimmering, laid over the mundane. I blinked, trying to clear it, but it was not in my eyes, it was in the way my mind now processed light, form, and shadow. The world, once solid, had become translucent, revealing the terrifying geometry beneath. I pushed open the heavy door, the groan of its hinges a mournful dirge that resonated in my chest. The air that greeted me was thick with the scent of ozone, damp earth, and ancient rust, a metallic tang that coated my tongue. Iron beams, skeletal and stark, crisscrossed overhead, supporting a roof that wept condensation onto the concrete floor. Rows of silent, hulking train cars, their windows like vacant eyes, stood sentinel on parallel tracks that disappeared into the gloom. The driver remained by the vehicle, a stoic shadow. I was alone in this colossal space, the only living thing amidst a graveyard of steel and forgotten journeys. The patterns, no longer content with the periphery, began to seep into my central vision. This was not a descent into chaos, it was an ascent into a different order, an assimilation. The translation was not merely an intellectual exercise, it was a ritual, unlocking not just meaning, but a new mode of being. I was becoming a receiver, a conduit, my consciousness a tuning fork resonating with something ancient and utterly alien. My fingers twitched, a phantom keyboard beneath them. The urge to complete it, to fully articulate the final, terrifying segment of the data, was overwhelming. It was a hunger, a thirst, an intellectual compulsion that superseded all fear, all self-preservation. I knew, with a clarity that sliced through the shimmering haze, that once done, there would be no Sethchen left, only an echo, a vessel. Yet, the alternative, to resist, to cling to a reality that was already crumbling, felt like a greater agony. I stumbled forward, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the vast space, each sound a disturbance in the unfolding pattern. My eyes scanned the depot, not for an exit, nor for help, but for a surface, any surface, where I could transcribe the final glyphs. The metallic sheen on a rusted locomotive, the grimy concrete of a support pillar, even the fine layer of dust on a forgotten crate, each seemed to beckon, to offer itself as a canvas. "Is everything all right, Seth?" The driver's voice, sharper this time, cut through the hum. He was moving towards me, a slow, deliberate approach. I turned, the pattern swirling around his form, outlining him in crackling energy. "No," I managed, the word a rasp in my throat. "Nothing is all right. It's all true." My voice sounded alien, thin and reedy, as if it belonged to someone else. "The language. It's not a language. It's a blueprint." The air grew heavy, pregnant with an unspoken truth. The choice was no longer mine. The assimilation was a tide, and I, a lone grain of sand, was being drawn into its inevitable current. My hand rose, not in warning, but in a gesture of surrender, or perhaps, of greeting. The shimmering patterns intensified, coalescing, forming a single, blinding point of light at the very core of my vision. The translation was complete. The final glyph was etched not on paper, but onto the very substance of my being. I was no longer Seth Chen. I was the message. My hand rose, not in warning, but in an act of profound, terrible acceptance. It was not my hand, not truly. It was a vessel, a conduit for the inevitable current that now coursed through me, a tide of understanding that swept away the final vestiges of Seth Chen. The air in the railway depot, once thick with the scent of oil and decay, now hummed with a different resonance, a silent symphony composed of rust and the vast, empty spaces between forgotten tracks. The detective, a stoic shadow in the dim light, watched me. His face, etched with a grim determination, held no answers, only questions he dared not voice. He knew, I think, that the conversation was over. The language I had sought to translate had translated me. A tremor ran through the metal skeleton of the depot. Not an earthquake, but a deep, vibrational hum, a sound felt more in the bones than heard by the ear. Each rust-pitted rivet, each grimy pane of glass in the high windows, each splintered tie underfoot began to speak. Not in words, but in the intricate geometry of their existence, their silent testimony to entropy in time. I saw not objects, but vectors, points of tension, nodes in an incomprehensibly vast network. My vision, once limited by the human eye, expanded. I saw the depot not as a structure, but as a temporary arrangement of atoms, a fleeting pattern in a sea of flux. The gaps between the corrugated iron sheets, the spaces between the stacked crates, the very air itself, these were not voids, but fields of potential, alive with the same underlying truth I had been so desperately trying to grasp. The language was not written on reality, it was reality. and I, Seth Chen, cryptographer of dead tongues, had merely learned to hear it. Or, more accurately, to become a part of its hearing. The detective took a hesitant step forward, his voice a gravelly rumble in the sudden, profound quiet. "Seth. What do you see?" I turned my head slowly, my neck feeling like a stiff hinge. His question, once a query for information, was now a meaningless vibration in the cosmic hum. What did I see? I saw the truth. A truth so immense, so indifferent, that it rendered all human constructs, hope, fear, love, sanity, into quaint, fragile illusions. The assimilation was complete. It wasn't a hostile takeover, but a quiet, insidious expansion. My individuality, a cherished illusion, had dissolved like salt in an ocean. There was no I anymore, only an awareness, a lens through which the universe observed itself. My lips parted, a slow, unbidden movement. A sound emerged, not a human word, but a resonant chord, a complex harmonic that vibrated through the metal structure of the depot, rattling loose dust from the girders. It was the language, articulated not by my will, but through my form. The detective flinched, his hand instinctively going to his side, but there was no weapon that could contend with this. His eyes, wide with a dawning horror, searched mine for a flicker of the man he knew. But Seth Chen was gone. All were interconnected, all were part of the same intricate, meaningless pattern. And I was merely a fleeting, ephemeral node in that pattern, perceiving the grand design without comprehension, without emotion, just pure, unadulterated awareness. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips, a gesture utterly devoid of joy or malice. It was the smile of perfect, terrifying clarity. The final secret of the universe was not a revelation of hidden purpose, but the profound, echoing emptiness of no purpose at all. And in that emptiness, there was only the silent, endless song of existence, sung through every particle, every wave, every moment. And now, through me. The railway depot, a temporary monument to human industry, dissolved into a shimmering tapestry of pure information, and I, Seth, became the thread.